So it's my pleasure now to introduce Professor Wilfred Pay. Professor Pay is a senior consultant and the former head at the Department of Diagnostic Radiology in Kutek Puak Hospital in Singapore. Now, he is the former chief editor and is currently advisor of the Singapore Medical Journal and a senior editor of the British Journal of Radiology. Got a suite of experience in terms of medical editing. So I welcome you to both Newcastle and to the podium, Professor Pay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. So I will introduce the other speakers in this session. Hopefully this will be a more uplifting session because we had a lot of interesting discussions earlier in the day, some of which are a little bit on the depressing side. So this is a very straightforward session on peer review, and I'll be speaking on this topic. The other speakers are Joey Lapena, whom I think everyone's familiar with. He's been around the whole morning and he's moderated the earlier session. Professor Peter Munk from Canada. He was the former editor of the Canadian Association of Radiologists Journal, CARJ, and he's a fellow musculoskeletal radiologist. So I think we are the only two musculoskeletal radiologists here in Newcastle in this research institute. And the last speaker is Professor Cecilia Maramba-Lazarte, who is a professor of pharmacology, former editor of the Pediatric Infectious Diseases Journal. And she holds multiple portfolios, including chair of the Herbal Medicine Institute in the Philippines. Okay, got it out of the way. Okay, so this is my talk. I'll talk about peer review concepts, process, models, and variants. So start with some concepts. So peer review did not always exist. So in the early journals, the editors solely decided on the contents of each issue. And I believe for this is recognized as the first journal, which was founded way back in 1665, Philosophical Transactions. And the editor, from my reading, he self-published his journal and paid for the journal out of his own pocket. So this is a journal from Edinburgh. It's the first journal to introduce peer review, and that was in 1731. And peer review has evolved since then. However, the practice of appointing external reviewers only became more common in the mid-20th century, including these well-known journals, which are top journals to this date. So peer review can be defined as the critical evaluation of a submitted manuscript by peers of the authors. So this would refer to doctors, scientists, and researchers working in the same area of interest or clinical specialization or subspecialization. Peer review is crucial to the reputation and reliability of scientific research. It helps editors make a decision on whether a manuscript is suitable for the journal. So I know the word gatekeeping is not very good. Maybe the word curation is better, as I learned this morning. So it helps the editors curate the knowledge pool, rejecting poor quality or unoriginal work, and promoting work that is good and suitable for publication. The other value of peer review is to offer feedback and constructive criticism to authors. So despite being less than perfect, most major journals, if not all, will still adopt peer review. So this simple diagram just shows that the reviewers are an important part of the whole scientific research and publication system. So we have the authors, researchers who produce the research and prepare the manuscript for publication. The editorial office coordinates and eventually gets the manuscript published and adding to the knowledge pool. And the reviewers are in between, helping the editor, advising the editor about the quality of the submitted manuscript. The process varies among journals, but most journals would have 2 to 4 reviewers per manuscript. Of course, there could be more if the editor cannot make a decision, and it depends on the editorial workflow. Reviewers are usually selected from a database. The availability of reviewer is checked, and then instructions to the reviewers are given, including time deadline for return of the review. There are several models. These are just a summary of the most common ones. So I will touch upon each in turn. I will use the word blinded throughout this talk. It's also the proper term is anonymized, but it's quite a mouthful, so I'll stick to single-blinded, double-blinded, and so on. So I apologize if I've offended anyone in the audience. Single-blinded review can be divided into 2 subtypes. The first subtype is when the authors know the identity of the reviewers, but the reviewers do not know the identity of the authors. Some people call this author-guided review, where the authors nominate their reviewers. So this is not very common. The advantages of this subtype is that it protects against potential reviewer bias. It's easier for the authors because the reviewers are already nominated, and this also reduces review time. However, there's potential for fraud because the authors can nominate reviewers, and there have been some unpleasant incidences, so quite a lot of journals have stopped this practice of author-guided review. The other subtype is more common. The reviewers know the identity of authors, but the authors do not know the identity of reviewers. So to this day, several journals still adopt this subtype. The advantage of this subtype of single-blinded review is that it protects the reviewers from authors because the authors don't know who the reviewers are, but there's potential for reviewer bias. The reviewer, as a reviewer knows who the authors are, they could be more severe on people they don't like, although they should declare conflict of interest, or they may be overawed by a big-name author and give a more favorable review. So this is just an example from a journal which I reviewed for. You can see that they've invited me to review, and I know, of course, the title, and I know all the names of the authors as well. And this is from another journal in which this is my reviewer page, and I can see the names of the articles and the names of the corresponding authors at the right-hand column. So it's an example of subtype 2 single-blinded review. The double-blinded review is probably the most common type practiced by journals. The reviewers are anonymous to the authors, and the authors don't know who the reviewers are. The advantage is that it negates the effect of personal dislikes or animosity by the reviewer because he doesn't know who the authors are, and negates the effect of big-name authors submitting manuscripts. This type of review is actually quite favorable to a lot of people, younger researchers, women, minorities, foreigners, authors from less well-known institutions, and from non-traditional centers. So it reduces a lot of the bias when the name of the author or the institution he or she is from is not well known. And it also protects reviewers because the authors don't know who the reviewers are. Triple-blinded review is a variant of the double-blinded review where there's an additional step of blinding. The handling editor, reviewer, and author are all anonymized to each other. So this further decreases any possibility of bias. but this is time-consuming for the editorial office, and sometimes complete blinding is difficult. I think those that work in the editorial office knows that a lot of times you can, by reading a manuscript, despite the best type of an anonymization, you can probably guess where the paper or comes from or who the author is. Transparent peer review is another variant of double-blinded review, where the reviewer's reports are published together with the article, but without names. So this is meant to make the whole process even more transparent to readers of the journal, because you can read the complete reviewer reports. Another variant of transparent peer review is when the editorial comments and correspondence are also published with the article. And this is aimed to provide complete transparency over the review process. The readers can judge the quality of the review, and the basis for editorial decisions are also transparent to everybody reading the article. Okay. Next, I'll go on to open review. As the name implies, everything is open. The authors and reviewers' names are revealed to each other. A UK House of Commons report has described this as an experimental system. So there are a few types of open review. It can be pre-publication, where the manuscript is sent for open review after initial assessment by the author. Another variant is when the manuscript is uploaded on the preprint server, and there's open participation by the research community with open exchange among the authors and reviewers. A variant is a decoupled review, where the review is done on a platform which is facilitated by a different organization. And among post-publication open reviews is a time-honored letter to the editor, which is a form of review after publication, where readers write in to the journal, commenting on the article, and the authors, of course, have a chance to respond. And selected letters could be published together with the author's responses. A variant is an online peer forum hosted by the journal, for example, BMJ Rapid Responses. And sometimes the other variant would be hosting of post-publication reviews by independent websites like PubPeer. So the advantages of open review is that everything is open and transparent. There is increased accountability by reviewers. And the reviewers get credit because their names are there, published with the review that they have done. Reviewers are less likely to be biased and more likely to put in the best effort for a better quality review because their names are attached to the reviews that they have done. And it's easier for readers to detect any conflict of interest by the reviewer. With the internet, there's the whole possibility of the whole review process being conducted openly online is now possible. Some cons of open review is that it can be quite difficult to get reviewers, especially for the preprint server variants, because people must be willing to contribute. This may lead to publication delay. There could be reviewer bias because reviewers may be reluctant to offend big name authors who know who the reviewers are. And there's always the danger of inadequate review in a rush to get preprint data released early. And this is highlighted by a joint statement by the medical writers, the three major medical writers associations. Hybrid review incorporates external open peer review in addition to traditional double-blinded review. And this is said to be favored by some open reviewers because they feel that they are not completely responsible for whether the manuscript is accepted, finally accepted or rejected, as there's also double-blinded reviewers contributing to the review of that particular manuscript. But of course, the disadvantage is that the whole process is delayed even further. I'll touch on the patient peer reviewers. So the aim of having patient peer reviews is to enable formal feedback from patients, patient advocates, and patient carers on the way a study is presented. And this practice has been adopted by a few medical journals. So BMJ is one of the first to adopt having peer review, and this is an editorial published about 10 years ago. And about a year later, they started the process. They implemented the process of having patients as peer reviewers. And these are a couple of other journals, BMC, Research Involvement Engagement, and this is a small journal, Patient Experience Journal. So there are a few journals that have patients as peer reviewers. So these reviewers complement the journal's conventional academic reviewers, and they're supposed to draw on their own experience as patients or patient advocates to advise on the suitability of a submitted manuscript. So this is from the BMJ peer review process flowchart. I highlighted in red at the bottom, peer reviewers as the additional set of reviewers. And this is, they employ open review. So the advantages of having patients as peer reviewers is that they can evaluate whether issues discussed in the manuscript are relevant to patients. They highlight challenges faced by patients and give opinions as whether any new treatment have potential patient benefits. Disadvantages, this concept is still not fully developed, and there are many concerns which have been highlighted in different journal articles about patient peer reviewers, including tokenism, failure to collect and use data on patient's experience, that means follow-up data, inability to get the patient's authentic voice, and possible commercial influences. In summary, peer review is currently adopted by all major journals. There are several models and variants of peer review, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. Peer review is still an imperfect system, hence the many different models and variants, but it's still the best way currently for quality control of materials submitted for publication. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you for your attention. So the next speaker is Professor Lazarte Maramba, who will speak on roles and responsibilities of reviewers.
Okay, so good afternoon. I was assigned to discuss the roles and responsibilities of reviewers. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm supposed to, okay, sorry. This is forward? Yep. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so these are just some of the references that I used to make this talk. So peer review, as mentioned earlier, helps professional, academic, and scientific writings thrive. They are key components in fostering excellence and quality in papers published in our scientific publications. It also gives writers useful feedback to improve their manuscripts, and the review helps the journal editorial staff to decide which manuscripts to publish and which to amend or reject. Peer reviewers are usually not paid, as we mentioned earlier, and these are volunteers, and they give their time and expertise in evaluating manuscripts. So peer reviews are said to be an altruistic system, but in other other models, there are some incentives given, and there are also a few who are paid. But majority, and especially in our country, for local journals, it is really a volunteer. So what are the role of peer reviewers? As a peer reviewer, you should also yourself determine if you are a suitable reviewer by your own expertise and that you have no conflict of interest. You should also follow the journal standards and guidelines and review the manuscript for relevance, originality, and scientific rigor. Also evaluate the submission properly and provide advice to editors on whether to accept, alter, or reject the manuscript. Now, peer reviewers have responsibilities to the authors, to the editors, and to the readers. The peer reviewers' responsibilities to the authors also depend on the peer reviewers to provide documented, impartial, and constructive criticism on the work's academic and scientific work. This input should be backed by evidence to ensure the reviewer's thoughts are transparent and justified. Also, the peer reviewers assess the author's clarity, conciseness, and relevancy. And the reviewer must also see if it has some appeal to the journal's readers. Of course, the peer reviewer has to be professional, should not include personal criticism in their reviews, and instead of criticizing the writers personally, their comments should be about the study itself and how well it was done. So this is why a double-blind review might be more preferred for some, so that they would not criticize them personally. So the reviewers help create a helpful and welcoming atmosphere that supports academic growth and progress by giving honest and polite feedback. Sometimes we do get some feedback that are not very polite, and sometimes we don't ask these peer reviewers back also. So this method keeps the review process honest, but it also makes the experience good for the writers. And the review process should also be a learning process for the author, even if they are rejected by the journal. So it's also the job of the peer reviewer to keep the peer review process confidential. They should not talk about or share any information from the reviewed work with other people unless this is consulted with the journal, unless it is also another model which was described by Wilfred earlier. So this builds trust between writers, reviewers, and the journal. Now, it is also important for the reviewer to tell the editor if they cannot finish the review on time. No? So, of course, they will be initially asked to do a review, and there is a deadline. If they cannot meet the deadline, they should say so. And sometimes this is also negotiated. If they say, oh, I can review not in 2 weeks, but submit in maybe 3 weeks. If the editor agrees, then maybe this can be done. So this lets the editor look for other options, and you will not be holding up the publication process for no reason. Also, the reviewer, if he cannot review, may suggest names of other skilled reviewers who could take on the job if they can. It is also the job of peer reviewers to let the editor know about any personal, financial, or perceived conflict of interest which may affect their judgment of the manuscript. This will keep the process fair and objective and should turn down the review if there are any such conflicts. Also, the peer reviewer must follow the editor's written directions about what the journal wants from the review in terms of its scope, content, and quality. This includes making sure that the feedback is in line with the journal standards, and the reviewer helps keep the journal's reputation for a strict and high-quality content by following these guidelines. So the peer reviewer are expected to give the author a thorough, fair, and helpful evaluation of the work that has been presented. The review should teach the author something and give ideas on how to make the work better. So that the editor can make appropriate choices about whether the work is ready to be published, and also helps the writers improve their academic skills. This evaluation would also include evaluating the supplementary material that the author sent for publication. So the peer reviewers look at submitted work to see how original, scientifically valuable, and comprehensive it is, to make sure it meets the standards of the journal. They should make suggestions for changes that may make the study better and clearer, and reviewers should give their opinion on whether or not the paper should be accepted or rejected using the marking system the journal prefers. And it is very important for peer reviewers to let the editor know about any ethical problems they find during the peer review process. This includes saying if there are similarities between the manuscript being reviewed or any work that has already been published, or any manuscript that the readers knows is being sent to another journal at the same time. Also, any ethical violations should be reported, like wrongly treating animals or people who are part of the study. Reviewers help keep the study and release process honest by doing this. Lastly, in general, although there are some systems that may be different, usually they should not communicate to the author directly. And as part of the duty to the editor, they must keep the review process honest by sending all comments and messages through the editor or the journal's filing system. Talking to the author directly could make the review process less anonymous and objective, which is important for a fair and impartial evaluation. So the peer reviewer also has responsibilities toward the readers. They should ensure that the methods in the manuscript and analysis section are detailed and transparent. This allows readers to critically assess the scientific validity and rigor of the study design. Providing sufficient detail in these areas is essential for enabling the replication of the research. Systematic reviews are also commonly performed by other research, so making sure that the methods are detailed is very important. Peer reviewers are also responsible for ensuring that an article appropriately cites all relevant work by other scientists. This helps acknowledge prior research and places the study in the proper scientific context and prevents plagiarism. So what are the ethical responsibilities of peer reviewers? They should maintain confidentiality, provide constructive criticism on manuscripts rather than just listing problems. They should only accept an assignment if they have the competence to provide an authoritative review. And ethics requires peer reviewers to be impartial and honest. Reviewers must examine submissions objectively without prejudice or conflicts of interest, based purely on research quality and value. Integrity also involves giving honest feedback not favoring or not being biased, and keeping the evaluation process secret. Okay. Ay, meron pa sa ila. How do you do that? Okay. So also, the author should disclose all conflicts of interest and review in a timely manner. Okay, what are some examples of reviewer impropriety? So distorting information in a review, causing unnecessary delays in the review process, or unjustly scrutinizing a rival's work, violating the trust of the review process, or suggesting modifications that seem to align only with the reviewer's own research or theories. We should also not use sensitive information for one's personal or professional advantage. Using ideas or texts from a manuscript under review for one's own use. Attacking the character, motive, or some other attribute of the person rather than the substance of the manuscript itself, or fail to declare a conflict of interest that would have disqualified the reviewer. So just to round it off, to summarize what is the good, the bad, and the ugly from this particular paper. So a good review would summarize the reviewed work, highlight merits and problems, and identify any deal breakers like plagiarism that might prevent publication. Offer detailed feedback on data design, presentation, outcomes, and the conversation. Discuss the originality, importance, and policy implications of discovery. Discuss problems such as missing references or possible conflicts of interest. So that's what a peer reviewer should do. What a peer reviewer should not do: give non-specific, unsupported comments on a document, or give recommendation extending the scope of work beyond the objectives of the manuscript, seek self-citation, break confidentiality, or involving others in making the review without consulting the editor. What peer reviewers should never do: reviewers should not evaluate manuscripts only for the sake of seeing them, nor should they review comparable manuscripts they may be intending to or have already submitted elsewhere. Reviewers who sat on submissions to submit comparable work first, or stealing ideas from evaluated manuscripts, or denigrating individuals or making charges in confidential editor comments with the understanding that the authors will not see them is inappropriate, or even being an imposter or impersonating someone during review. So maybe we should all remember the golden rule of reviewing by Munk. Say yes to reviewing whenever your duties and schedule allow. Provide a thorough, fair, and constructive critique of the work, and do it at your first opportunity regardless of the deadline. Review for others as you would have them review for you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Cecilia. That was uplifting and inspiring. So next I'll call upon Peter Munk, who will speak on the structured review.
Well, thank you, Wilfred. I'd like to thank Dr. Talley for including me as part of the faculty for this meeting. So I'd like to also thank the previous speaker, because what she said sort of overlaps a little bit, but reinforces what I'm going to say, and I really like that golden rule idea. So greetings from Vancouver. So I'll try to describe a few of the basic principles of peer review. We've heard a little bit about some of that. I'm also going to talk to you about the best way to structure reviews in order to facilitate things both for the editor and for the authors of papers, and it really makes your own life a little bit easier as well. So peer review, as you've heard, is used by most journals. Does that sound funny? And it's very important in improving the journal quality and the reputation of the journal if it's done properly. And it's usually blinded, as Dr. Pei pointed out. And basically, peer review has to be done by somebody that's knowledgeable about the subject included in the paper, because otherwise it's very difficult to actually do an accurate and effective review. So a review has to be critical, it has to be reasonably unbiased and constructive. And the reason I say reasonably unbiased is that very often when we're reviewing each other's work, sometimes we have our own sort of points of view about a certain subject, but it's important not to let that impinge too much on what it is that you say about the paper. Now, the reason the editor is sending this to you is because he or she wants assistance in determining what's acceptable for publication. But there's more to it than that, because one of the things that you're going to be doing also is helping out the author of the paper to improve what they're going to do. And you have to remember that you're probably going to learn something from it yourself if you do it properly. So you determine the quality of the manuscript, or at least what your opinion is, how novel or original it is, and whether there's any value to the particular readership of the journal that you're dealing with. It may be suitable for another journal, but perhaps not for the one that you're actually working for. And most journals will request more than one reviewer, sometimes 2 or 3, and sometimes an editor will even solicit more than that if it's considered a controversial paper or there's a lot of conflict amongst the reviewers. It's also important to remember that you as a reviewer, if you're doing the reviewer, need to be treated reasonably pleasantly, that you shouldn't be sort of looked down upon. And it's also important to realize that once you've taken on the position of a reviewer, you have to respect the obligation that you've been given. If you're going to say you're going to do a review, you should. You shouldn't dawdle or just ignore it. And I think all editors can say that they've dealt with situations where that isn't the case, and it's very frustrating for not only the editor, but also the authors. So the reviewers are responsible for a timely review, have to protect the integrity of the journal and the discipline that the journal represents. And of course, you want to avoid the publication of poor or faulty data. And you heard a little bit about the importance of considering ethical considerations when reviewing the journals, the manuscripts submitted to journals. All of us as editors have gotten back, one line, sometimes one word reviews saying, "Oh, this is awesome, you should publish it," without any justification. That's an opinion, it's not a review. So ideally, we want to do better than that, and hopefully we can put together a few ideas as to how that's to be achieved. So the job of a reviewer is to see what the authors haven't seen, and not merely to decide whether or not the journal should accept or reject an article, although that's a crucial and important component of it. You have to remember that one of the things you're doing is helping out the author to improve the work that they put together. Even if you look at a manuscript and you say, "Not suitable, I'm going to reject this," your work doesn't end there. You have to be constructive and positive. So you're not there just to be a barrier to the journal or to be hostile. You have to be sympathetic and constructive. So in general terms, what a reviewer looks for is to see if the topic fits in with what the journal publishes, and is the readership going to be interested in whatever the subject is? And does the author have a message that they want to transmit? And we'll get back to this a little bit later. And sometimes you look at a manuscript and you say, "I've read this before." And I had this happen a few years ago where one of the manuscripts we got, I sent it to a reviewer who happened to be in the office next door to me in my own department. And half an hour later, he came across, opened up a different journal, and it was the same manuscript, word for word. That was interesting. Things like that happen. So when you're a reviewer and you get an initial view of the manuscript, first thing you have to decide is, do I know enough about this subject? If you don't really know enough, probably you shouldn't be reviewing it, and the editor will respect that. Then you read the manuscript quickly, and sometimes you'll read a manuscript and you say, oh, I know what's going on here. And sometimes you think like, it's not clear to me what this paper is about. Do a rapid read through just to get an idea of what the paper is all about, where it's going, whether you think it's reasonably easy to read or not. And then you can decide, is this new? If it's a review paper, is it truly educational? Or are we looking at the same old thing? So you have to have sort of a general review structure in your head. Sometimes a journal will help you out by providing you with a template where they have all the different things they want you to comment on. That's helpful. But you have to have a template that you like to use, that you're comfortable with, but it has to be systematic. So the details are going to vary a bit depending on the type of paper. Obviously, a review won't be the same if it's a review paper versus an original scientific paper. But the nice thing to do whenever you start writing a review is you start with 2 or 3 sentences right at the beginning of your review saying what you think the paper is, in general terms, all about, at least how you perceive it. Because if you do that, probably other readers will the same way. And then after that, you have to give yourself an impression about what the main strengths or the main weaknesses of a paper are. And this is the way that I like to see reviews done when I send something out to somebody for a review. So what the reviewer should be looking for in terms of strengths, what sort of things? So is the paper correctly or logically structured? Does it follow the format, for instance, that your journal specifies? Is there some sort of clear application or value to the paper? If you can't think of how anybody's going to use this, probably other people won't be too interested in this paper either. So is the methodology reasonably clear and sound? We go through, do you think you could reproduce this study yourself? And the other thing is the paper easy to read? So the weaknesses are a bit of the flip side of this. If you're looking at a paper and you can't see what the point or value of the paper is, probably nobody else will as well, and why should they read it and why should it be in the literature? Are we going to be any better off that this paper has been published, or is it just going to clutter up the literature? If the paper looks vague or unclear methodology and you couldn't reproduce the study, how are we to know that this was done properly? How is anybody else going to be able to use it? So you have to have some clarity. There has to be a focus to the paper, otherwise what's the point? The other thing that I sometimes find is you go through the whole paper and then you read the discussion, and it's almost as if sometimes the author doesn't know what he did or what the point of it was. You really can't follow it. Something that sometimes happens as well is sometimes there's a very poor command of the language, especially if English is not the primary language of the author. And sometimes there still may be very good ideas, but the paper may have to go back to the author with a recommendation that they get a native speaker to actually help them rewrite the paper, because at least with most journals, they don't have the resources to go and rewrite the paper with the author. Sometimes if there's an extremely important or extremely valuable point to the paper, they may choose to do that, but it can't be routinely done. So the reviewer should point out, if possible, what the weaknesses are, whether they're correctable, and help the authors sort of see this and possibly rewrite the paper and bring it back for further review afterwards. So after these general points are sort of addressed, it's very helpful to do sort of a section-by-section review. This makes it easier for the reviewer actually to go through the paper and analyze it systematically. Okay. Check it out. Yeah. So anyhow, so it's nice to have a systematic way of doing it. And the easiest way to do it is by the individual parts of the paper. So once you've gone through the paper and done the initial sort of first review that I suggested at the beginning, you look at the title and you think, does the title match what I just read? Okay? Or does it summarize it all? Does it reflect what it should? Because very often readers will go through and they'll look at the titles of different articles. Based on the title, they may decide to look at the abstract. That may be the only exposure your paper gets. So you want the title to be reasonably clear. You want it to be reasonably succinct, not so succinct that you can't tell what's going on. But whenever I see a title of a manuscript and it goes on for 5 lines, you sort of think couldn't we make it shorter? So sometimes it's necessary to have a long title, but usually you can make it a line or two. Is it an accurate reflection of what you just read? Is it clear or ambiguous? Sometimes people are so obsessed with having a sexy-looking title that they don't really convey what's in the paper. Then the abstract. So the abstract for most scientific articles should be structured. Most journals mandate this, and they usually explicitly state that. Have the authors done it? So it has to be reasonably concise. You don't want the abstract to be a page and a half long. It should be just a few paragraphs, 4 short paragraphs. Sometimes these paragraphs can be only 1 or 2 lines. And it has to reflect what's in the paper. There's nothing that's in it that should be in the abstract that isn't elsewhere in the paper. And the important, crucial aspects of the paper should be reflected in the abstract. So the two of them have to be reconciled. And the other thing to consider is that usually keywords are solicited by most journals for indexing purposes. So often people will put in keywords when they look for papers. You want to make sure that the most important issues are actually reflected in those keywords. Then there's the introduction. Sometimes people treat an introduction as it's almost a mini review paper. They want to discuss everything that's happened before, and there'll be like 40 citations. You don't want that. What you want is an introduction that consists of 3 paragraphs. Usually you can do this, say, in a page, page and a half. The key, most important papers that came previously should be cited. So your introduction to the topic should have a handful of really important citations put in there. There should be a succinct synopsis of the background information. The purpose of the paper has to be stated. You've just told them what's come before, so what's your plan? What are you going to add? Have the authors made this clear to the reviewer? What it is that this paper is going to add in addition to what already exists in the literature. The next section is going to be the materials and methods. So basically, what you're doing here is you want to know what was done, how was it done, how was the data collected, and how was the data analyzed. And it should be sufficiently detailed, sort of like a recipe book in some ways, that if you wanted to go out and reproduce the study, you would be able to do it. There wouldn't be key aspects of it missing. So what you're looking for, is there any flaws that you can see? The other important thing to look at is to see if there's any ethical issues. I can still remember as a trainee years ago reading in a very, very high-profile radiology journal. There was a paper that came out of a respected institution on diagnostic pneumothorax to look at pleural disease. And that was sort of interesting. And they said that they had baseline controls, and they had volunteers consisting of the entire second-year medical school class that had agreed to do this. Well, I mean, nobody would believe that now. Nobody believed it then, but it was considered okay. It wouldn't fly now. So things like that are important considerations, as mentioned by the previous speaker. Sometimes people inadvertently put in results in the materials and methods section. It's a common error. So it's helpful as a reviewer if you point that out and they can move it over. So of course, the details are going to vary quite a bit depending on what the individual topic is. Oh, getting dry here, excuse me. Other things to consider is have the authors put in the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Is it clear what those are? Where did the population come from? How was it derived? Are they volunteers? Is it retrospective? And is there some sort of provision for a statistical analysis? Are the statistics that are being used appropriate? If you're not sure about that, as a reviewer, you can state that. You can say that maybe there should be an additional statistical reviewer, and that's perfectly legitimate. The other thing, what kind of drugs were used? What sort of equipment was used? You have to specify precisely what those things are, who the manufacturers are, and many other little details which will depend very much on what the individual paper is about. Next, you go to the results. And one of the things that you look for is, has the data that was promised to be extracted been presented? Sometimes the materials and methods will say that A, B, C, and D was measured. When you look at the results, only A and B are discussed. Why is that? They need to account for that. The demographics should be very clear and unambiguous. And are the results presented in an intelligible way? Have appropriate tables or diagrams been used? Are the captions clear in explaining what it is you're looking at? And the other thing that sometimes happens amongst authors is they'll discuss, well, actually they'll put in the results in a narrative form, then they'll put it in a table, then there'll be a diagram. You don't need that much redundancy. And they think they're making things clearer and more helpful for the reader, and maybe they are, but usually it's not necessary to do all of that. And then there shouldn't be discussion of what the results are in the results section. That's what the discussion section is for. And again, sometimes people in their enthusiasm will be tempted to do that, and it's something that the reviewers should point out be moved to a different portion of the paper. Are the statistics presented? Are they clear? Again, you may require a separate reviewer for that if you're not a statistics expert, and that's okay. Now, as a radiologist, of course, I always think about the importance of images, and if images are any sort of part of the study or helpful in outlining the results of the study, you have to decide whether there's enough of them, too many of them, whether they're of any good quality. Sometimes look at orthopedic journals, and it's always amusing for a radiologist to see images printed upside down, but it's probably not what should happen. And and it's important also with images that be stripped of identifying data. Occasionally you'll pick up a journal and you can see the patient's name in the corner, bold as brass with a birth date. Again, that shouldn't be the case. So the discussion, there's several components. There should be a summary of the major findings, an explanation of what those findings potentially may mean or what the authors think they may mean. And are there study limitations that are honestly brought up? And whether there's any future areas of investigation that have been uncovered by the study. So the first paragraph should succinctly summarize the results without comment about the importance. You know, if you've been doing a study for 2 years and your whole world has been immersed, around it, you sort of have your nose pressed up against the window a little bit, and it's sometimes hard to see the big picture, and you think this study, changes the nature of the universe and, the future of our civilization. It's not really good to state that, and as a reviewer, sometimes it's important to curb the author's enthusiasm. Importantly, in the introduction, the authors are supposed to have stated what it is they're seeking to uncover by doing this study and publishing this paper. Have they actually done that? Have they discussed whether or not they've achieved that? And are the results different from what's already been published? Are the results very different from what they expected? If so, why they think that's the case with appropriate citations to the previous literature? And has something been overlooked? You sometimes as a reviewer, you're standing a bit further back, and you can often see something that should be or should not be in the discussion that the authors are too close to it to be able to see. Have they misinterpreted or misquoted something? So it's important for the authors to state if they found something that was unexpected. Sometimes they are reluctant to do that because it wasn't a part of their original hypothesis and it feels uncomfortable. So sometimes it's necessary for you to very quietly suggest that's the case. Have they been honest about the limitations to the study? Have they overlooked or worse yet tried to hide something? Are there any possible immediate applications? Sometimes a study will be done and it's quite clear that a certain antibiotic or treatment should be used to treat something. Other times it's not quite that bold or clear. If there's future research that's indicated, what is it and why? If the authors feel that there's something that they left out that should have been addressed in the study, say so. So are there any new questions, essentially, that are brought up? So the main reasons for reviewers recommending rejection are listed here. There's other reasons as well. Poor statistics is very common, so that's why, as mentioned earlier today, it's important to bring a statistician or somebody comfortable with statistics early in the structuring of a paper, and sometimes the authors can go back and fix that. Sometimes it's impossible. As I said, it's important for the authors to stay modest, and a reviewer, you can encourage that. Poor or suboptimal description of methods we mentioned. Sometimes population numbers are too small for a study. It goes back to the statistical analysis. If text is hard to follow and it's really difficult to read, sometimes that can be remedied, but it's a very common problem. And sometimes the authors simply don't have a clear purpose, and you have to point that out. So what happens then? You've done the structured review, you've put it together as best you can, you've been polite and helpful, then you have to make a recommendation. You have to try to help out the editor, at least as you see it. So there's two things. One is the overall quality of the manuscript, and the other one is, does it really contribute anything to the literature? Basically, can you follow what the author is saying? Is it logical and clear? Is it readable, grammar and syntax, or is it a struggle to determine what the point of the paper is and how to follow it? You can tell the editor whether you think the flaws are large or small, whether it's correctable or not, or whether it's just not worth investing more time in it. Then does it add to the literature? If it's an original paper, hopefully you've learned something new. Sometimes it can be a small refinement that's useful. Other times it can be something radically new and even start a new branch in your subspecialty. Confirmatory papers sometimes are useful, especially if there's not much data out there. If what you're doing is essentially confirming something that the last 40 papers have confirmed, you're not adding to the literature. If it's a review article, then is it any better than any of the other review articles that have been written? Is it up to date enough to be worthwhile? Case reports have decreased in popularity in recent years. They don't get as cited as much, and editors sometimes have difficulty putting them in their journals because they're afraid it'll affect impact factor, et cetera. But case reports can still be useful if it's something completely new or something that's unbelievably rare. It all boils down to, you have to know something about the body of literature that exists before you can help your editor make a recommendation. And the other thing to consider is there's a spectrum of reviewers. Now, they range from the zealots where nothing is ever good enough, everything is flawed, and they're ruthless and reject everything, and sometimes, they have difficulty even being polite. Well, that's not really very helpful if you're going to reject everything, except what they write, of course. And sometimes they're softies. They feel badly, Oh boy, this paper isn't that great, but I don't want to pop their balloon. And so we should take everything and work with them to make it better. It's well motivated, but it's just not practical. And so what you have to do is find a place somewhere in between the two. The bottom line is you always have to remember to be professional, be polite, be constructive, even though sometimes it's just exasperating. You just want to sort of tear your hair out. If you're rejecting, state very clearly why. It's a learning opportunity for the authors. And remember not to put the authors off of ever wanting to publish anything again, especially inexperienced authors that are early in their career. If you crush them and throw a wet blanket over them, they may never ever want to do it again. And that's not a good thing. I can remember the first papers I wrote, sometimes I wince when I look back on it. So I've tried to give you sort of a very brief review of something that, it can be a day-long workshop. So I hope I've given you a couple of points that may be useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was a very nice, comprehensive coverage of a structured review. So the next speaker is Joey Lapena. I'll just introduce him a bit more in detail since I was very brief earlier. He's a ENT professor, a professor of ear, nose, and throat, a clinical professor and a former vice chancellor at the University of the Philippines in Manila. He's the editor-in-chief of the Philippine Journal of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery. And he has a lot of leadership positions. He was the charter president of the Philippine Association of Medical Journal Editors, former president of APAMI, and he's a secretary of the World Association of Medical Editors. So it's my pleasure to ask Joey to speak on this topic, current developments and future issues in peer review. Joey.
Thank you, Wilfred. I thought you were going to embarrass me again, so he'll do it tomorrow. We're friends. At the end of this session, we will discuss NISO terminology, some pros and cons of types of pre-publication peer review, sharing peer review across journals, third-party review services, reviewing registered reports, and AI and peer review. The NISO terminology encourages editors to use standardized terms released by the National Information Standards Organization. And this just summarizes Wilfred's earlier lecture. They actually state that peer review should be described using 4 components: identity transparency, who the reviewer interacts with, what review information is published, and whether post-publication commenting takes place. So idea transparency, as Wilfred said earlier, ranges from having all identities visible, these are unmasked reviews, to single anonymized or single mask reviews, to double anonymized or double masked reviews, and triple anonymized or triple masked reviews. When we talk about who the reviewer identifies with, then that could be the editor only, which is a model in many traditional reviews, directly with other reviewers, with or without their identities visible, or directly with the authors, with or without their identities visible. There is a collaborative revision model, which is actually seen in various different settings, different examples of this, including in Australia, I believe, consulting with the traditional people who live in the land. And this type of review is by necessity open because it can't be anonymized. What review information is published ranges from having no information at all, which is traditional in many journals, to having a range from summaries to reports. And when we talk about reports, you can have reports depending on whether the author opts in or whether the reviewer opts in as well, having your reviews published, to having the actual submitted, the original manuscript published with or without the author opting in, as well as publishing correspondence with the editor, including the response of the authors to the editors. And then the identities may or may not be published, whether they are the identities of the reviewers or of the editors themselves. Now, whether post-publication commenting takes place does not include letters to the editor. And this 4th item is only mentioned if online comments are given, either in open or invited manners. So the most common, in summary, form of medical journal peer review would be described as follows: identity transparency, single anonymized, reviewer interacts with, editor, and review information is published, none. No mention of post-publication review in this case because there is no open review taking place. What about sharing peer review across journals? In the panel earlier this afternoon, I think this was alluded to. And it's a model where journals share peer reviews of what would have been rejected for the mother journal, for example, but maybe too good to just throw away. And therefore, you have a sister journal where you can actually make use of the original reviews and move the paper over to another journal with the agreement of the authors and reviewers. So typically, these journals all belong to the same consortium, and the paper is literally passed on. In our case, for example, from otolaryngology head and neck surgery to Oto Open. And I believe it's also available in the JAMA Network and Lancet journals, as well as many neuroscience journals. So here's an example of the actual review form for Oto, HNS, and Oto Open. And you can see underlined in red at the bottom the transfer authorization. So if the reviewer agrees to have their review used for the sister journal in case the manuscript is transferred, then that will take place. There are also third-party or independent review services such as Editage and Enago, and this is an emerging business model that operates separately from journals and their editors. They're particularly popular among non-native English speakers. And for a fee, they provide editing suggestions and other improvements to authors prior to submission to a peer-reviewed journal. So here's an example of the actual webpage of Editage. And Scientific Editing Pro actually advertises not just what they do, but they even show who their reviewers are. Now, this does not substitute for the actual review in the journal to which a manuscript is submitted, but at least it gives the authors a dry run, so to speak. And these services are increasingly being used for a fee, of course. Interestingly, this article came out just last July about whether authors could be saying goodbye to the accept-reject decision. And the model that is alluded to is this, eLife, which is an independent, supposedly nonprofit, committed to improving the way research is reviewed and communicated. For $2,400 US, so it's nonprofit, you can actually submit your paper to them, and if it is acceptable, it will already be published as a reviewed preprint. The thing about this is the authors then undergo peer review, and they may opt not to revise the paper further. They may opt to just go ahead and list the reviewed preprint, because it has been reviewed, in their CV. Now, whether this is going to catch on is another thing, but this is now available. And by the way, how do you go back? Sorry. The reviewed preprint is submitted to Medline. So it's actually indexed as a reviewed preprint. Yeah. You're frowning too. Okay. I was just telling you about new developments. What about reviewing registered reports? What are registered reports? These are regular research article reviews where frequent requests for further data collection when the study has been completed that are more frequently rejected, entailing multiple rounds of review at different journals. This is the problem, right? So authors are often asked to revise, okay? So somebody came up with reviewing registered reports. And what it does is it adds a round of review before the data gathering period. It's like an early review. In effect, what happens is the journal, in principle, accepts the research protocol. So the delay is not after the final paper. The delay takes place before data gathering begins. It's like an additional IRB, or it's actually a technical review, but conducted by the journal. This actually supposedly results in an overall faster turnaround. Why? Because they use the same referees for the final paper. And therefore, they claim that it actually eliminates a lot of time in terms of constant revision and additional data and so on. So the delay created by the peer review process prior to data collection pays off in other ways because the authors can now incorporate the feedback before they actually begin to collect data at a time when the feedback can be most helpful in revising the protocol. Now, again, these protocols are already deposited in a repository of the journal, which has accepted the protocol in principle, meaning the authors now know that their paper is eventually going to be published as long as they comply with the recommendations of the reviewers. Okay, and finally, and we will have a longer panel on this, I believe, tomorrow, AI and peer review. Now, publishers are increasingly using forms of AI for different editorial processes, and editors should be aware of their use and potential ethical implications. They should also inform reviewers and require that they report if they used AI in their reviews. I think this is an important thing. We can't prevent people from using AI, really, but we can actually require them to let us know when they use it. So those are two different things. However, publishers should not replace peer reviewers with AI. So I was actually a bit worried when that opinion came out earlier that eventually we're going to, maybe some processes can be conducted by AI, but they should not actually replace the judgment of a reviewer. And this is very important. Reviewers are responsible for any content and citations generated by the LLM or the AI or the ChatGPT or any other chatbot, and should be aware that they retain all the prompts that are fed to them, including manuscript content. Now, this is problematic because most papers that are reviewed have not yet been made public, meaning they are not published. They are still private, confidential property. And once you submit them to a chatbot, they are no longer private because the chatbot can reuse them and can interface with other systems, and that you will find the data elsewhere. So we in WAME had several recommendations as far as this is concerned, and our fourth recommendations is that any use of chatbots in the evaluation of a manuscript and generation of reviews and correspondence should be specified, and their use should be explained. But at the end of the day, using AI in peer review breaches confidentiality because of that inability of chatbots to keep something confidential. They're just going to reuse them and incorporate. In fact, I was going to, Nick's not here anymore, but if he asked ChatGPT the same question he asked before giving us his recommendations, the answer would not be the same. And so when you look at recommendations for citing, and our librarians are no longer here, you notice that when you cite internet, you cite the day, you put the date cited, right? But when you cite chatbots, you put the time cited, not just the day. Because what they will tell you and what they may hallucinate or fabricate or confabulate actually changes in real time, not by the day, by the minute even. So, okay, there is a broad consensus in scholarly publishing that AI tools will make the task of ensuring the integrity of the scientific record a Herculean task. However, it seems that many publishers still haven't figured out what their policies on AI are. And I think that's certainly a topic that can be debated upon, it would be another impossible topic, so to speak. Like, how do we actually use AI and for different publishing practices? So in summary, we discussed NISO terminology, some pros and cons of pre-publication peer review, sharing peer reviews across journals, third-party reviewing services, reviewing registered reports, and AI and peer review. And I'd like to end by asking the question, where do we go from here? And that's, I think, something that conferences like this and even after we go home, we have to tackle. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much to the four speakers for a really fantastic session. I'm now going to invite Wilfred, Peter and Cecilia to come on up and take a seat with Joey, and we'll have some discussion from the audience and answer any burning questions that people may have had throughout the duration of these presentations. So welcome everyone to the stage. Are there hands gone up here? So I'll go to that question first.
Thank you all I'm Shamima Lashkar from Bangladesh, and thank you for all the presenters for their wonderful presentations. I am going to ask to Wilfred, first presenter, that he classified different type of the peer review system. We have seen that the research article presented to the present in the conferences, and can you tell me, and the audience give their feedback, and they can incorporate within their thesis or the research article, then that it will publish later on. So this is also the peer reviewing. A PhD student presenting, audience giving the feedback. This is also the peer reviewing. Can you tell me what type of the peer reviewing this is? Is this?
Okay. Actually, I won't classify that as peer review because the peer review I'm referring to is peer review for manuscripts. Open review.
It's not yet the final paper. It's just a conference presentation.
Yeah, it's a conference. Okay, so a peer review I'm referring to is for manuscripts submitted to journals. So I think normally, if you present your work, your research work as a conference, there's what we call free paper, right? At the end of it, there'll be question and answers from the audience, and most of the time, I mean, there's useful feedback. I'll say there's feedback on your work from members of the audience who's listening to your presentation. And of course, most authors should incorporate those comments if they're useful to improve their manuscript before they submit to the journal. So I'm not sure whether I will classify that as peer review.
Okay, can we classify to the open peer review system, this type of peer reviewing? Can we classify?
Yeah, but okay, I mean, when I refer to open peer review, I refer to manuscripts which are submitted for publications rather than oral presentations and scientific meetings. Maybe I'll let the rest comment on that if you have a different view.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. You're getting feedback on an initial presentation, but it's not yet the final manuscript. So our session was on actual reviews of manuscripts submitted for publication. I agree that presenting in a conference is an excellent way of getting feedback and maybe refining your paper based on the questions asked in an open forum. But that's not yet a formal review process for the manuscript.
Is that okay? We have a question up the back and then in the middle.
Thank you very much. This is Professor Dr. Nurul Goni from Bangladesh. Thanks to all presenters and for their smart and nice presentation clearly. This also we try to, if peer reviewed without any bias, I would like to say it's really without bias a very nice one. So second presenter, I want to just please explain us how to measure this competence and confidency. It's all about this peer review, measure the competence and confidence. This is the vital one without any biasness. Thank you very much.
So sorry, can I just get you to repeat the end part of that question?
Question is that in the peer review, who done the peer review without any biasness, they should be very much competent, isn't
Competent,
it?
yes.
How can we measure that value is with the competent? Is there any tools to find out the competent?
Well, actually, it's very difficult, probably, and subjectively say. As a reviewer yourself, you should judge if you have the expertise to accept such a review. Oftentimes, the editor is not that familiar with some of the reviewers, and some of us may have received some articles to review which may not be really in your scope of expertise. So it's really difficult, it's really subjective for you to say if you are an appropriate peer reviewer or not.
So, thank you very much. When you like to this article prepare the quality one, it obviously go to the editors. So is the responsibility for the editors? He could just measure him. Yes, he is a competent one. That's why I would like to know from you. Thank you very much.
So some of the editorial systems for the editor or associate editor choosing the reviewers will actually have you have a summary of the person's expertise as part of the choice of that the choice of the reviewer. And then a good editor, I think, if they don't know that person's area of expertise, will actually seek that information. And I guess that's why there's the different levels of editorial support throughout the process, from the chief to the senior associate, so that.
What is the quality-based article? Through this quality-based article, obviously, this person may assess that he is a competent one. That is my question. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. So there was a question. Thank you. There was a question in the middle here. Yes. And then
just 2
a row
points.
down.
The first one, question directed to Prof. Joey. So Prof. Joey just now highlighted a good point where involved the AI and also publications. So you mentioned that for when you put in something into the ChatGPT or any of these learning program, what happen is you are converting a private entity or private information into a public domain, and subsequently you lost hold of the control of it. Yep. So my question is this because we are hailing from low-income countries with a lot of non-native speakers, a lot of our students or young researchers, they resorted to this ChatGPT for their sort of like review or screening tools. So especially for grammatical errors or to refine their language, instead of resorting to expensive, the editing service. Because most of these young researchers, they do not have funds to use the editing service. So in this case, do you think it is justifiable to use the ChatGPT or any of these services?
Okay, I'll answer that in 2 steps. For the first step, I agree that our young colleagues have gotten used to resorting to not just ChatGPT, other large language models and AI in general. And this became quite evident during the pandemic when Zoom became a thing. Because in the past, we'd have bedside preceptorials, and if you asked a question, people had to answer you face to face. But now there's a very perceptible delay before they answer, because you know that they're searching for the answer. And okay, so I have to admit that I cannot prevent them from using it, but I can caution them about their use, especially if they're aiming to publish. By so doing, they are actually making their work public prematurely without their knowing it. Now, on the second level, as far as my reviewers are concerned, I will actually forbid them from using it at the moment. I may change my tune later, but at the moment, with what I know of that vital issue of breaching confidentiality, then I will have to ask a reviewer or all reviewers in our journal not to resort to using ChatGPT.
Okay, second point. I think the question from a professor from Bangladesh, he's asking, how do you choose a competent reviewers?
Okay. Well, first of all, we list our reviewers according to their basic qualifications. And then we ask reviewers to actually identify their areas of competence. So we assume that if you check your area of competence is maxillofacial surgery, or your area of competence is head and neck tumor surgery, then if we select you, we expect you to be competent in that area. But sometimes it's a very specific and subspecialized area. And then even the general competence is not enough. And maybe that's what Prof. Cecil meant earlier when she said a reviewer can actually say that I'm not confident in this area enough to review this paper. Yeah.
Just to add on that, I'm from MOJ, Malaysian Orthopedic Journal, and for MOJ we have a bank of reviewers where we screen all those reviewers, and those who qualify will be included in the bank. So we will choose the reviewers inside the reviewers bank. So we have all those competent ones inside the bank, and those who are not active or not, then we'll probably just put them on hold first. And I think that's the thing that to ensure that we have a good quality and competent reviewers. So probably that will be to answer your question.
Thank you very much. Okay, so, yep.
Wilfred.
Thank you. I am Didi from Indonesia. I have 2 questions. The first one is how, if the manuscript submitted is already published in preprints, then how will the peer review process go? And then the second one is, in the double-blind review process, both the authors and the reviewers should not know each other, right? But sometimes the reviewer know the authors from the acknowledgement. How is your perspective on that? Thank you.
That's a great question.
Well, if something has been already submitted as a preprint, it's important that when you submit the manuscript, you tell the editor, okay? It's important for them to know that, okay? You can still have a blinded peer review and just hope that the reviewers haven't seen the preprint so that they're not already familiar with the paper. Sometimes authors will reveal who they are within their manuscript. They'll state things like the institution that the study was conducted in, or they'll cite a previous paper that they published. So, you know, when you submit a manuscript to a journal, it's important to consider blinding that material, sending 2 copies of the manuscript to the editor, letting the editor know. So the covering letter should have all these things in it. Okay? Sometimes people will still be able to figure out who the authors are, especially if you have an area of, yes, it's highly specialized. There may be a relatively small community worldwide. There may be only, I don't know, 40 people that do it. And sometimes they even collaborate with each other, so it becomes even smaller. Well, sometimes that just can't be avoided, and you just have to hope that people will be professional about it and not have their own axe to grind. You know, I mean, it's subjective, okay, but sometimes there's no way around that.
Can I ask a follow-up on that in terms of how to deal with the preprints? When something you've submitted to a journal, it's gone to preprint, then what if it's rejected from that journal? How is it dealt with for the next resubmission to another journal when it's already been in the public domain?
That's true. The preprint is already public. There's no way of getting around that.
So they can't reject it then? Is that
Oh, no, they can reject it. They can
yeah.
reject it because you're talking about different levels of making it public. And there's nothing wrong with that. And one of the problems with preprints is sometimes a preprint will end up getting loaded, okay? The manuscript goes for review and becomes significantly changed, but the preprint is still sitting there.
Yeah.
And sometimes the preprint, the unmodified preprint, ends up getting cited.
Yeah. So it's
And that does produce confusion, and it can
So
be a
many-
serious problem.
Yeah, because many journals ask, has this been published elsewhere, and could limit your potential to publish in that journal.
Well, it depends on how the editor wants to handle it. The editor may say, well, you know, it was in good faith put on a preprint reservoir, right? But now it's gone through peer review, it's been modified and improved.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a different version. And that's perfectly legitimate. It shouldn't be something that precludes you from publishing it through a proper peer-reviewed system.
And there was a second part to the question, and then we've got another question here, and then down the front. There's questions everywhere, look.
Minister, can I just add
Did you have your second part?
to the previous question
yes.
about the acknowledgements?
Yes, that was the second part of the question.
So, yeah, it should be blinded. Good journals will blind everything in the paper, including references, acknowledgements, and of course, institutes mentioned in the materials and methods. So that's why there's a lot of work for the journal editorial office to do a complete blinding. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that sometimes, as you say, reviewers can identify where the article is from, either because he has heard it at a conference, especially at a regional or local conference. So it's quite easy to take the conference, presuming, oh, this sounds familiar, look at the conference abstracts, and you can match straight away to the journal, that the article that's been sent to you for review. So in that case, the reviewer should declare to the editor that he can recognize the manuscript. Then it's up to the editor whether or not to discontinue the reviewer or to allow the reviewer to continue with their review.
Okay.
I'm up. Cool. Mark Cooper is my name. Thank you for the talk. Peer review model is one of my favourite topics, so I found your talks great. There's worrying new evidence about the way peer reviewers sometimes can misuse their position. There was an interesting paper just this week by Oveda Garcia about peer review mills identified through plagiarism and what have you, which are done for a variety of reasons to get incentives and rewards. But some peer reviewers are churning out peer review to coercively cite their own papers. That's an old practice, but it seems to be growing in prevalence. My question is, what can an editor do to help stop that problem, coercive citation?
Okay, peer reviewers give recommendations to editors. It's up to the editor to whether to forward the recommendation or not. So in such a case, an editor may actually choose not to forward that part of the review. That's my opinion. I would not, if I believe that a reviewer was inadvertent or even intentionally trying to unduly benefit from the process, then I would, in the same way that I would improve the language of the review, and remove anything offensive or derogatory. I would probably edit out that part and not forward it to the author. What about you?
Probably the same, and maybe keep in mind this particular reviewer and possibly not ask the review again.
Yes, thank you all for a wonderful presentation. Actually, a very important topic. I have perhaps some strong views about the models of reviewing, because I think the danger with assuming that blind review is always best because it takes out the kind of conflict of interest or having an aggressive reviewer. But it works the other way because we're dealing with humans, and humans are flawed. And what worries me more is that if someone is actually thinks that they're going to be critical, they will not accept the invitation because they don't want to upset, as mentioned in your presentation. But it might work the other way as well, that somebody would accept the invitation and be very happily to declare who they are because they're currying favor with that very influential group. These are the people that are going to be reviewing their paper or their grant. So to some extent, this declaration of we all know each other, there I am declaring myself, is not necessarily actually a positive thing. It might actually work the opposite way by allowing some work that is maybe weak or flawed to be published because it received a glowing endorsement by an identified reviewer. As for the blinding, I mean, I think that's kind of getting a little bit too it's too much hard work for no apparent benefit. I mean, part of the assessment as reviewers, I want to know the track record of these people. I mean, if somebody submits some work, are they actually, recognized researchers in the field? Not because I want to curry favor with them or I want to criticize. It's just because to avoid all of the stuff that we talked about with fictitious papers and people that have absolutely no track record whatsoever, and they're publishing a paper submitted to a high-impact journal. There is value in knowing who the authors are, and then the editor can then decide whether there is any conflict of interest or unfairness in terms of the assessment of that work. So leave all the work with the editor to decide, but in terms of the peer review, I prefer to have somebody just honest and say what they want to say without being identified, so that there's no conflict in that way.
Any comments? Lots of nods.
I think those are very valid comments. That's why there are so many variants. There's no perfect system. And I think, most journals will decide what is best for them. So those are good comments. And no perfect system.
Okay, over here.
Hi, I'm the deputy editor at PHRP, which is a public health open access journal, online only. And I'm really interested in how patient review works. What is an appropriate topic to include a patient review? The only thought I had was involving patients that far along in the research process, does that introduce problems in terms of, as opposed to bringing a patient on board in the design of the study? So it's more of a collaborative effort. I guess my initial question is, what type of papers would you include a patient review?
Okay, I'm not sure how many journals employ patients as reviewers. I think very few. As far as I know, there are only a handful, including BMJ, but there are just very few. And some of the journals really engage patients. So some of them have patients on the editorial boards of their journals. And BMJ, I think they just select articles which they think in which they think the feedback from patients. So it's not just patients, but patient advocates and patient carers. So I think they want feedback as to, from the patient's perspective, whether the study is useful and whether it has value to the patient and whether there's something which the academic reviewers have overlooked. So it's not solely patient reviewers, but it's an additional set of reviewers. So I think that's the best I can answer, because a lot of journals don't I've talked to some other editors, a lot of them don't believe in patient reviewers. So I think in perspective, there are only, as far as I know, only a small handful that employ patients as reviewers.
Okay, over here, and then we've got 2 questions on the other side.
Thank you all for that discussion. If I could just maybe step out a bit. Would any of you have done reviews not of completed already manuscripts, but the IRB review or the ethics review? And when you do the ethics review, would you do a purely ethics review, or do you do a scientific and ethics review? And how different is that from your manuscript review?
Who would like to tackle that?
Controversial.
Yes, I've served on an ethics review board, and in our institutional review, sometimes you cannot separate doing a sort of technical review, because if it's not scientifically sound, then it is not ethical to perform. So it's also part of the review.
I think I would like to add to Prof. Wilfred's comment on the patient's reviewer. I think that is more relevant for ethical committee, because sometimes you are too involved in the scientific comment and scientific content of the process, and you ignore the patient's perspective. So that is where the patient's perspective comes in terms of the patient reviewer in the ethics committee. Thank you.
Okay, we have another. Sorry?
From ethics.
Yeah.
Paul, did you have a question? No, it's all right.
I don't know if there are any other questions. We're nearing the cocktails, but I might just ask, one of the things that didn't come up in any of the presentations was around, and this is really around capacity building. So we've identified issues with peer review and trying to find peer reviewers, but many junior people finish their PhD kind of at the top of their game in terms of being across the literature, but may not feel confident in terms of peer reviews. So some journals have started to do peer support, I guess, in terms of reviewing. Could anyone comment on that process?
Yeah. Okay, so first, APAMI itself has been conducting workshops, and among the workshops we've been conducting are peer review workshops, where we actually help people review actual papers and practice confidentiality in reviewing the papers. So these are actual manuscripts, and these are guided workshops with plenary discussions and outputs. We also have workshops on medical writing, case report writing. So we've been doing this for many, many years. But having said that, there are journals that also have their own mechanisms for training peer reviewers. In the American Journal of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, I'm a peer review mentor. And what happens is, as a reviewer, mentor, I'm paired with a trainee. The trainee is usually a fifth-year or fourth-year resident, senior resident, who has already published and who enrolls in the resident reviewer program. So what happens is I'm paired with a trainee, and whenever the mentor accepts a review, the trainee is automatically invited by the review office. Your mentor has accepted a paper to review. Would you like to review the paper? So the mentor and the mentee separately review the paper, after which the mentor submits his or her review and then is given the review of the mentee, which is not given to the authors. It's given to the mentor. And the mentor is supposed to review the review and to comment on it in detail. And at the end, the editorial office comments are given to the mentee as well. So the mentee sees the comments of the mentor and then sees the comments of the editors. And usually by the third review, for a good trainee, they are now given the chance to review on their own. And they are now graded by the editor. After which they are now invited as a reviewer if they pass. So It's, okay, that's one. The other was Publons used to have a review program, and I was a mentor there also. I've had mentees from different countries, Italy, Korea, and South America. And this was open. You get to know your mentee, you get to actually email one another, and then you become friends afterwards. And you both get a certificate, like they get a certificate of undergoing the Publons review training, and then you get a certificate as their mentor. So there are models available. You probably have your own, and if you don't, maybe it's something you should consider for your journals, because it not only adds to your reviewer pool, but it also allows you to train younger colleagues in peer review, which is a very important thing.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? Peter.
Part of what Joey's been talking about is the responsibility or the ability of journals to train peer reviewers. It's really important. And I think what APAMI's done with having these workshops is very valuable. I sort of look at things from my own country's point of view, Canada. And when you look at trainees after medical school that are in residency programs, postgraduate training, I mean, these are all people that at this point are starting to consume more of the literature, so to speak. Very few of them, almost none of them, get any systematic training in how to assess the literature. One of the easy ways to learn how to assess the literature is to learn how reviews are done. Yeah. And if you understand how reviews are done, you sort of look at manuscripts, well, you look at them more critically and also with more appreciation as to the amount of work that has gone into getting the paper to that point. But it's amazing. There's training in all sorts of things that are done, you know, various social aspects of medicine, all of which are important, but not very much in sort of critically assessing the value of literature and how it's done. I think if we did that, we may find it a bit easier to get peer reviewers, maybe not, but at least the consumer would be more discerning.
Thank you for those comments. Does anyone want the final word? If not, then please join me in thanking our expert and excellent panel.